Hello and welcome to The Pink Underside, Women, Men and Hereditary Cancer, a podcast by Dr. Sharlene Hesse-Biber. In this episode, Dr. Hesse-Biber talks to me, Chris Garrington, about what difference it makes to women if they inherit the BRCA gene mutation from their father or their mother. She starts by explaining what we know about the hereditary gene and its links to cancer.
So a BRCA mutation is a mutation in either BRCA1 or BRCA2 genes, which are really tumor suppressor genes. And it's estimated that 5 to 10% of all breast cancers are linked to these two mutations. And inherited genetic mutations increase individuals' risk, a woman's risk for breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and other cancers. So about 12% of women in our general population develop breast cancer at some time in their lives. But if you have the BRCA mutation, that goes up to 55 to 65% of women who inherit a harmful BRCA1 mutation. Around 45% of women who inherit a BRCA2 mutation will develop cancer by the age of 70. So that's important to note that if you have this gene, it really dramatically increases your risk, for example, of breast cancer and also ovarian cancer over the course of your lifetime. Compared to women, men have a lower risk of getting inherited breast cancer every year. Approximately 2,000 men are diagnosed with the disease and 400 die from breast cancer every year. So that men are also at increased risk, and they're also at increased risk for pancreatic cancer, testicular cancer, and the onset of prostate cancer. And the kind of prostate cancer that men get has a poorer survival rate.
Now, for this particular study, you wanted to see whether inheriting the BRCA gene from your mum or your dad made a difference to how daughters manage their risk of getting cancer. What was your thinking behind that? Why did you want to look at this specific question?
Well, it started out when I was sitting down with one of my students and she showed me a bar graph of the number of men and women in my larger study survey that inherited the gene from their mothers and fathers. And then I was also intrigued by the idea that 80% of men don't know about genetic testing. And I'm putting those ideas together. I really wanted to see that if their daughters inherited this gene, would they be at increased risk for developing cancer compared to the women who inherited from their mother, who were more alerted to the history of cancer in their families, whereas their women's family history, inheriting it from their father, seemed to be almost non-existent.
Now, you've spoken before about both the online surveys and the in-depth interviews that you've carried out with women. Remind us what information you managed to gather and what details from those that made this research possible.
Well, I asked the women in the study about the age at which they tested for the BRCA mutation. I asked them about whether or not they were diagnosed with cancer and at what age. Was this when they were tested, they knew they had cancer, or were they tested and were cancer-free? I also asked a series of psychosocial questions that would alert me to the degree of distress or vulnerability that women who were tested and women who were diagnosed with cancer might exhibit. So I thought putting both the psychosocial and these other demographic questions together would enable me to look at differences in impact when you inherit a gene from your mother's side or your father's side.
Now, in terms of the basic numbers of how many women in the study got the gene from their mother and how many from their father, what were you able to establish there?
Overall, in this quantitative sample I'm talking about today, I had 408 adult female BRCA-positive mutation carriers who answered our survey and also identified their parental origin of their mutation. And again, following up with 56 intensive in-depth interviews with some of these women. More specifically, I found that 236 women got the gene from their mother and 172 got the gene from their father, making it easier for me to compare these two groups.
Now, you looked at whether the women were proactive or reactive in the way they managed their cancer risk. Can you explain what you meant by that?
To be proactive meant that these women, the proactive women, got tested and didn't have cancer. The reactive women got cancer and then they got tested. That is, they found out they were BRCA positive only after they got their cancer. And very often, it's interesting in this group, when I interviewed some of these women, they would say to me, I presented with cancer. No one said you should get tested. I had cancer. It was only a few months later, sometimes in some cases a year later, that these women finally went back and said, my sister got cancer. I must have a history. So it was that it's not that they got cancer and got tested right away. It's that they really had to prove, and especially if they were younger, they had to prove to those gatekeepers that decided whether or not they could have this genetic test that they in fact had a history. So that in waiting for the results of whether or not they were BRCA positive, many of these women not only went, say, from stage 1 cancer, if they waited a year, they waited a half a year, then the cancer became more invasive. Sometimes it moved 1 or 2 stages more to a more life-threatening type of cancer. So cancer came, but then they had to wait for their diagnosis of the BRCA mutation, and it made it more difficult for their cancer to be treated early on in its earlier stage.
Now, in terms of being either proactive or reactive, age also mattered, didn't it? The daughter's age mattered.
Daughter's age matters in general. The younger women have cancer less than older women. So it's a kind of biological fact that the older you get, the more higher probability is that you'll contract cancer. While we can say that in general, the younger you are, the less probability is that you'll get cancer. But if we look at the reactive and proactive women, and age, how age comes into the equation. In the sample that I have, 68% of the BRCA positive women tested for gene mutations between 28 and 48, and 95% before the age of 58. Women who inherited the mutations from their mother's side of the family tested 4 years earlier than those who inherited the mutation from their father's side of the family. So that women who are alerted to their history of cancer in their family, especially from their mother's side, tend to get tested earlier, take proactive interventions like mammograms and other kinds of prophylactic mastectomies than the women who get tested later who inherited it from their father's side.
How important was it whether or not the daughters had children themselves?
If the daughters had children, they were more likely to get tested in general earlier. So children really made a difference in when daughters got tested. And holding other things constant, BRCA positive women who have children are 1.8 times more likely to take a genetic test before cancer diagnosis than those who do not. They feel a moral and personal responsibility, for example, to disclose this information about genetic testing and risk to their children in general.
Now, one of the really interesting things to emerge was that daughters were considerably more likely to have the genetic test themselves, if a parent had been diagnosed with cancer, but more so if it was the mum and less so if it was the dad. Have I understood that correctly? And if so, can you talk us through what you make of all of that?
The fact that the mother was diagnosed with cancer, she either died of it or survived it, increased her daughter's odds for taking the test before the cancer diagnosis by over 200%. If we compare that, on the other hand, to father's cancer history, women say my father's, died from a cancer-related illness. This is not at all significant. It doesn't matter. So really, if you put these two stark findings together, we can say that BRCA-related cancer is typically and misleadingly usually viewed as a disease of females. It can only be inherited from the mother's side of the family. And again, we're masking the cancer diagnosis, male cancer diagnosis, sort of gets thrown under the bus. We underestimate the father's cancer history. We tend to, even when we know it, we tend to downplay it.
Now, you were very keen to see whether the women struggled more, psychologically speaking, if they inherited the gene from their mum or their dad. Which was it?
I think when they inherited the gene from their fathers, they're blindsided. they didn't see cancer coming, they got it. And I think that really this blindsidedness, the fact that cancer has appeared, they suffer significantly higher levels of uncertainty and negativity overall. And they seem in general to be feeling more harm psychologically in response to their genetic test results. It hits them really hard. They're thinking, I might have prevented this. Now I'm BRCA positive. As I mentioned before, some of them were struck with cancer and had to wait to get this genetic test to prove others that they were at high risk. And in the interim, it was sort of like a double whammy. They presented with stage 1, but by the time they knew they actually had the mutation, which was more virulent, they were struck again with a more serious stage of cancer. So it was sort of like a double whammy for them, making that impact harder to deal with.
Indeed. This is, really groundbreaking research, Sharlene, and it's painting a very new picture of hereditary cancer, how it plays out, its impact. What would you say that those involved in the testing and treatment of cancer should take away from this?
I think that we can't dismiss father's history. I think it's all too easy for the medical profession to only ask about the mother's family tree. It's interesting. I saw in one genetic testing site, ask your mother, and I wanted to say, ask your father. Even many genetic cancers remain unaware that women can inherit their mutated gene from their father. They might collect it sort of a little bit, but it's maybe not as routine as it should be. And there's deficits in understanding among healthcare providers in general that women can inherit this gene from their fathers 50% of the time. That's a huge percent. One of the women in my study went the first time with cancer. She couldn't get her insurance company to pay for genetic testing, even though she was young, because she had no reported history. And of course, no one bothered to ask her if she had a history on her father's side or to go and explore that. And then about a year later, when her sister developed cancer and they had sort of a history of cancer, both were able to get tested. But for her stage was much later than the first time she asked for testing. So there are these horrible consequences as a result.
And some lessons there for the wider public. For ordinary folk, what should we learn from this about what conversations we should have within families and the questions we should ask of one another?
I think it's important to maybe sit down at the family table sometime and really talk about the genes path within both sides of the family, especially when you have few aunts and older sisters. We need to sort of unmask and go back maybe more generations. I remember one of the women who she told me she had no history of cancer in her family, and she found a lump in her breast at 33, went to the doctor, and he didn't quite believe it, but she had cancer. And he said, where did this come from? She said, there's no history in my family. Her father and mother divorced about 2 years before that, and they weren't really speaking to each other. But she called up her father and said, Dad, is there a history of cancer? He said, well, why don't you call one of our aunts there in Scandinavia? So she happened to call 2 elderly aunts who said, we both have cancer. They were something like in their 90s. Had she not called them, she wouldn't have known. So it's things like that, being so blindsided. As a result, not only did they check her breast, but they also checked for ovarian cancer and found out that she also was showing signs of ovarian cancer. So not only at 33 did she get her breast removed, but she got her ovaries removed. If she waited another year, she might have been dead. It's knowing that history that can save lives. And this is why it's important for us to be like detectives, to have those conversations we may not want to have. Men don't want to talk necessarily about cancer. They feel very guilty about the men that I've interviewed whose daughters have inherited cancer. They are broken up. They can't believe it. And even fathers where there's a history of BRCA in their families, they don't want to be tested. So we have a lot of education that needs to take place here.
From Fathers to Daughters, Parental Origin of BRCA Mutations and BRCA-Positive Women's Proactive Management of Hereditary Cancer Risk is research by Sharlene Hesse-Biber and Xie Yi. More information is available at www.hessebiber.com.